And if you at any point want to hear the interpreter louder or just the interpreter sound without the original audio, then you can click on mute original audio, and that way you will only hear the interpreter's voice. If you have any issues with the interpretation function, please let us know in the chat and Stanley or I can assist you. Hola, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Naira Pacheco y yo seré su intérprete para la sesión de hoy. Esta sesión será interpretada del inglés al español. En unos momentos cuando activemos esta función, usted verá un icono de un globo aparecer a la derecha y al fondo de su pantalla. Usted podrá hacer clic aquí y luego seleccionar su idioma, que en este caso sería español, si requiere interpretación. Y si gusta poner en mudo el audio original para solo escuchar el audio de la intérprete, puede hacer clic en la opción de silenciar el audio original y así solo escuchará a la intérprete. Si necesita apoyo accediendo a la función, favor de dejarnos saber en el chat y ya sea yo o Stanley le podremos ayudar. Si usted quiere hacer una pregunta en el chat o durante la sesión a voz alta en español, siéntase libre de hacerlo. Nosotros podemos interpretar y traducir su pregunta para que pueda hacerlo en el idioma que se sienta más cómodo. If you want to ask a question in Spanish, whether it be on the chat or out loud, please feel free to do so. We will be able to translate and interpret your question so that you can fully participate in the language of your preference. Gracias y ya podemos activar la interpretación. Okay, and thank you. And we will now activate interpretation. And les pedimos unos momentos antes de comenzar. And we ask you all for just a few seconds while we troubleshoot a little glitch.
Thanks so much for your patience, everyone. Just be one more minute.
Gracias por su paciencia a todos. Será un momento más.
Okay, thanks so much for hanging tight with us, and it looks like we've got it figured out. So our interpretation feature is good to go. Okay, well, so just a few housekeeping notes. We will be using our chat and question and answer feature. So please feel free to connect with other attendees there and us as well. And we'll have time for question and answer at the end. But I encourage you to share your questions throughout the workshop, starting now. Also, a recording of the session and its corresponding slides will be made available afterwards. And that'll be available in both Spanish and English. And please know that if any sensitive information gets shared, we're happy to edit it out of the recording as well, since this is a space for this group first and foremost. But I'm happy that this will be available for others as well after the fact. And before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the Chumash people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that Santa Barbara sits upon, their home. We are honored to be guests upon this land and are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Chumash community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. And gratitude to Mia Lopez for developing this statement. And next, I'd like to welcome my fellow coworker who's been part of the fund for many years, wearing many different hats. And I'm really excited that she's able to witness the development of this workshop and join us, and it's an honor to work alongside her. So welcome, Patricia.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to give a short welcome. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Patricia Solorio, and I'm the Director of Grant Making for the Fund for Santa Barbara. But as some of you may or may not know, I actually came from the Grant Making Committee. So I was on a committee, just like Jennifer, Suzanne, and Rachel. I think Suzanne and I served together, and I'm really, it's really given me a great understanding as I came on. So I've been with the fund. I just celebrated my 3rd anniversary with the fund, but it feels like I've been part of the fund family for much longer. Prior to that, I also used to write grants to the Fund for Santa Barbara. And this is why I think I feel really strongly that this workshop is so important, that I would have appreciated having the opportunity to really learn about writing grants to other foundations with some more guidance. It was kind of a hit and miss for me as I came into grant writing, you know, by getting thrown into the deep end of the water. So this is a great opportunity, and thank you first to Stanley for helping putting all this together, and especially, of course, to Suzanne and Rachel and Jennifer for taking the time to help, not help, actually develop this workshop and make it available to you all. So, and in light of writing grants, and if you haven't written grants to other foundations, writing grants to the fund is very different. So the opportunity to really learn about what it's like to write grants to other foundations that don't quite do all of the technical assistance that we tend to provide, you know, including previewing the your proposal. It's, you know, working and addressing the root causes of societal problems are not really in the wheelhouse of a lot of other foundations. So learning how to massage the message, but still continue your work is really important. So I just want to thank you all for joining us and taking the time to learn, and know that the Fund for Santa Barbara is here not just for grants, but to provide you support in your journey of learning to write grants to other foundations. So with that said, I will turn it back over to Stanley and the GMC team, Suzanne, Rachel, and Jennifer. Again, a huge thank you, NIDA, for providing interpretation, which is really important, and we're grateful that we have the ability to do that. So thank you all.
Great, thank you so much, Patricia, and I'm so glad you could join us. I'd like to again introduce our three brilliant panelists for our series, who I've had the honor to work alongside. Suzanne Valerie, Rachel Johnson, and Jennifer Navarro. They're all volunteers with our grant making committee and have dedicated their time and shared their wealth of expertise with us. I strongly encourage you to read more about their extensive resumes on our landing page. They bring decades of grant seeking experience in both government and private foundation worlds and individual donor development. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But they have a particular sense of what it's like to be an organization working on addressing the status quo and navigating the foundation world. So again, welcome and thanks for joining us. And before I hand it over to them, we're curious who's in the room with us right now. Obviously, being virtual is much different than being in a physical room together. So I encourage all our participants now to take a second and share with us in the chat box just your name, and if you're with any organization, as a kind of a virtual hello. So we kind of see who's with us today. And I'll go ahead and pass it on to Jennifer, or I'm sorry, to Rachel, who will guide us through today's program. Welcome.
Excellent. Rachel. Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing in the chat box who is with us, and welcome back. Just as a quick recap, looking at our learning objectives, so why you're taking this workshop in the first place. In our first week, we went through understanding the explicit and implicit rules of grant seeking, got an overview of proposals, but really spent some time digging into the big picture ideas around grants. So whether or not that's sort of assumptions that are brought to the table when you apply for a grant or that the funders bring, and also the really important ideas surrounding diversity, equity, inclusion, and how to make sure that your proposals are keeping those big picture ideas in mind. Today, we're going to move forward in our learning objectives and look at some of the specific tools and resources and really dig into creating the building blocks so you can write fundable proposals and sort of increase the tools in your toolbox to position yourself for success with a variety of funders as you apply for grants. So with that, I will pass it along to Jen, who actually, Stanley, if you want to advance the slide once more. Yeah, so today we're going to dive into proposal design. We'll start with Jen, who's going to talk about what is a statement of need and how to create one. Suzanne will be going through how to create things like objectives and activities as part of your toolkit, and then we'll wrap it up with budgets and financials at the end. And with that, I will pass it along to Jen.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, well, good morning, everyone. So as Rachel mentioned, we are going to start with our statement of need today. Stanley, if you could please advance the slide. Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right in. So what is a statement of need? So a statement of need is the portion of the proposal that shows what community needs the organization or project seeks to address. This is done typically using a combination of stories and data, and it's a narrative, okay? The better able you are to articulate your needs through stories and data, the stronger your overall statement and overall proposal will be. I want to point out that typically the statement of need reflects deficits, reflects the deficits that the population is experiencing. And so for the purposes of the DEI framework we established in the previous slide, or in the previous presentation, we want to make sure that instead we focus on an asset model, which actually uses asset mapping to focus on the resiliency and the resourcefulness of the population, and uses that to bridge the gaps, okay? We don't want to focus on deficits and refer to those deficits as being in the population. We want to focus as there's gaps that, you know, there's gaps in services or gaps in whatever, and we want to focus on how resourceful and how collaborative the populations are in addressing and bridging those gaps. And again, that's part of our DEI framework. So that's just a little bit of an acknowledgement. All right, next slide, Stanley. So there's four core components to a proposal of need, or a statement of need. So first and foremost, the statement should clearly identify your needs. So for example, if you're a healthcare provider, and I work for healthcare providers, so this is my like default in my brain. Broadly, the community need could be for healthcare. The community need could be more specific. It could be for reproductive healthcare. It could be for mental health care, or mental health. Or there can also be different needs, right? There could be a few different needs that your organization is addressing, and you can have different strategies for addressing those needs. It should also include who your intended population is. Here in this webinar, we're going to refer to, and we're going to use the term intended population, but typically in grant jargon, you'll see target population. And we're referring to the same thing, but as part of our, again, our DEI work and our anti-racism work, we want to stay away from negative language such as target population that can lead people to think about like targeting folks, because, you know, historically that's been really problematic, and we know what targeting folks looks like. So we want to stay a little bit away from that language. If you do see it, and you actually will see it in proposal questions, just know that that's what it's referring to, and know that you can shift the language really easily just by saying our intended population is, rather than saying our target population is in your grant proposal. So your intended population will include demographics and any other descriptors of the people you serve. So again, if you're a healthcare provider, maybe you're a safety net healthcare provider, so your intended population is people who have low incomes. Maybe you're a hospital, so your intended population is everyone in the city, right? Or in the county you're located in, or something like that. So that's the people who you intend to serve. I want to point out that I also said people with low incomes rather than low income people. And again, that's another really easy language shift, because language matters, to having a DEI framework within grant writing, right? Just because someone is experiencing something doesn't mean it defines them. And it's the same reason why we say someone is depressed, or maybe someone has depression, rather than that's a depressed person. So in the same way, we want to, when we're defining our intended population especially, we want to make sure we're really doing our due diligence to have the DEI framework, and to really dignify the population that we're serving. And so next, we want to explain why the need exists and why it's important to fulfill these needs. So, for example, if we're a healthcare provider and we're in an area where there's a shortage of healthcare providers, or maybe insurance isn't affordable, there's a lack of affordable insurance, etc. You can make your case for why the need exists using local and national data. And I do believe we have a resource sheet that I'm not sure if it has been sent out or yet. You might get it after this presentation, that has all sorts of websites where you can pull data. But like, for example, a healthcare organization would pull data from like Santa Barbara Public Health here locally. You can also pull data from California Department of Public Health and compare and see how the area you're in is compared to like state data and national data, and help make your case in that way for identifying some of those needs. And then furthermore, you would also describe why it's important, not only why these needs exist, but also why it's important to fulfill them. So for example, you know, being able to provide affordable healthcare provides access for people who maybe don't have insurance, and then that leads to healthy long-term outcomes for those people. So that's, you know, making that connection as well. And then finally, last but not least, you should be able to clearly relate to the mission and purpose of your organization. So if you're a healthcare provider, you may not ask for a grant for a summer youth camp, right? Because that's not necessarily related to your mission and purpose. And so you want to make sure that it clearly relates to your mission and your purpose, okay? And so we're gonna go on to a couple examples next. So if we can advance the slide. I wanna just disclaimer, these examples are really, really simple. There's more that goes into it, but this is just a base setting, okay? A foundation setting. So the first example is an anti-racism organization. So we would say, or our needs are for an anti-racism training and for policy advocacy. Our intended population is nonprofits, businesses, corporations, as well as, you know, legislators, right, for our policy advocacy, or elected officials. Why? It's because there's been hundreds of years of systemic oppression, countless examples of racism today, and then, you know, why we need an extension of like why we need to fulfill this need. You know, people will be safer, people will have better outcomes, people of color specifically, if there's anti-racism information, okay? So when you're crafting your narrative, you want to start by defining these needs. And then you can go in and you can look for your stories, you can look for your data and build your narrative. The thing is, the reason why it's so important to say, okay, we are an anti-racism organization with a need for anti-racism training and policy advocacy to nonprofits, businesses, and corporations because of hundreds of years of systemic oppression and countless examples of racism today, that if gone, will improve social outcomes for people of color, right? Like that is your really simple need statement there. And then you build around that. If you start by doing that, then you won't get lost, right? Because if you don't start with defining these things, you run the risk of getting lost in stories and data, and the funder, the reader, not being able to pick out what your needs are. So you could even start your need statement with that first sentence being that, and then explain, you know, this is the backup data, this is the stories that we've seen, anecdotal, or, you know, whatever. So that's really important for painting a full picture. But again, you want to start with your foundation like this so that it doesn't get lost in the narrative. And a lot of the times reviewing proposals, we go in and we're like, wait, what is it that they need? And we have to read it a few times to pick this out. And if you have it super clear, if you start here, then it'll be super clear throughout your narrative, and then you can weave in the stories and the data into your narrative. Next slide. Again, here we just have another example. So let's say we're an environmental organization and there's a community need for recycling education among children in their formative years, ages 10 to 7, because there is excessive plastic in the ocean. And if that excessive plastic is removed, then that is better for all of the ecosystems for animals, and better for us as well as humans to have cleaner water, cleaner oceans, and all of that stuff, right? So again, that's really simple and really straightforward. And then I would go in and I would find some data that supports, my claims. I would include some stories. And stories are really, really powerful, especially in all proposals, because if you just present data, then it's just data is data. It's not that interesting. It's those stories that really add the human element to the narrative. But having data also makes your proposal stronger, because there's like this hard evidence that things are happening, and it appeals both, depending on who's reviewing your proposal. It may not always be committees, but it'll appeal to the fact interested person, and then it'll also appeal to the more storytelling person. And I'm telling you, when we have this stuff in the grant making committee, it facilitates really, really good discussions, and just makes for a really strong proposal. And so again, these are just a couple examples. This is a really quick, what is a needs statement? But the needs statement will be the base kind of your entire proposal, and then it'll inform your objectives, it'll inform your activities, it'll inform your timeline, and it'll inform your budget. And so Rachel and Suzanne are going to expand on the rest of the proposal once you've set out your statement of need or your needs statement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. And we'll go ahead and pass it off to Suzanne, who will guide us through objectives, activities, and timeline. And we'll pass it off to you, Suzanne.
Okay. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Jennifer. This section of your proposal is critically important because it delineates, it details what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it. And you're going to be focused in particularly on the impact that you have on the problem or the need that Jennifer just identified. As she said, your goals stem from your mission, and your objectives then are geared toward the outcomes you hope to achieve. Simply stated, there are basically three types of change that can be achieved: changes in knowledge, changes in action or behavior, and changes in condition. However, I like to refer to this what we call a continuum of change. And if you look at it, you could be gearing your objectives toward developing greater awareness around an issue, focusing on increasing participant satisfaction with your service, changes in perceptions and attitudes about a particular issue or situation, all the way down to knowledge and skills, behaviors, and ultimately conditions in the community. This is important to keep this in mind because you want to focus on what you can actually achieve within the timeline of the grant period. So you could say a number of strategies can be employed. If you could go to the next slide. A number of strategies could be employed to achieve your end. However, you probably can't do them all. So you develop objectives at various points along the continuum that fit within your project period. If you've got a 1-year funding cycle, you're probably not going to get from awareness to change in conditions in the community. But you can establish milestones that are approximations of the status of the project at various points along the way. So basically, we're talking about a theory of change. A theory of change represents causal relationships. It's basically, if we do these activities, then these intended outcomes will result. You want to think in short term, intermediate term, and long term. I call this an if-then approach very simply, and I'll give an example. If students have assistance with their homework, then they will do better at their schoolwork. If they do better at their schoolwork, then they will get better grades and attend more regularly. If they attend more regularly, then they are more likely to graduate. And if they graduate, they're more likely to become gainfully employed. So here you can see the continuum, starting out with homework assistance and ending up with gainful employment as your intended outcomes. So I mentioned you can establish milestones. So you've got steps in the sequence as periodic indicators. You can see that your program, these periodic indicators help you see where your program is along the continuum to meet your objectives. Targets, however, are the numerical standards for success, and it's based on data and experience. Jennifer talked about providing data in your needs statement, and you provide data also in your objectives because you need to know the standard what has existed and a target for what you're going to improve, how you're going to improve. Another example I'll state, suppose we have a jobs program. An outcome might be that participants get job offers. A milestone might be that they get interviews. And a target might be that X% of them apply for appropriate jobs. Stated otherwise, 85% of the people who enroll in the jobs program will complete the training within 1 year and apply for appropriate jobs. 75% of those who apply will be offered interviews, 50% of whom will receive job offers. Now, I know there are some assumptions in there, but it's just by way of giving you an example of how you can craft an objective using milestones and targets. So in order to know where you're at along the continuum to attain these milestones and to meet your objectives, you need to be collecting data. And you need to be getting feedback from all relevant stakeholders at various points along the project. You don't want to wait until the end and say, oh, gee, we should have surveyed people, or, oh, gee, we should have asked people for how well they are satisfied with this project. So it's good to put together a data collection plan. And even including this in your proposal is a good idea. Not all funders will ask you for this specifically, but telling them that you know what data you're going to collect and who's going to collect it and how often it's going to be collected, where it's going to come from, will let them know that you actually know what you're talking about and what you're going to do. Now, your activities will flow from your objectives. Your proposal will likely have more than one objective. There's many strategies that you can use to address the problem or the need. And each objective would have its own unique activities. In grants jargon, we call these outputs, the things you're going to undertake to meet your objectives. In the jobs program, for example, one activity would be recruitment and enrollment. Another would be the delivery of the training. And yet another would be the mechanism used to track the milestones and targets you set. Yes, I like to include my data collection and methods of tracking milestones as part of an activity in proposals. Essentially, activities are the tasks that you're going to undertake. So I would like to suggest that you actually plan this out in a work plan, an activity work plan, to detail those activities in chronological order over the project period of the grant, called the timeline. Now, yes, you might be undertaking some of these activities before the project period starts and continue after the project period. But for the sake of a proposal, it's best to keep your activity work plan geared to the funding period where the funds are available, what you're going to do with the money that this funder is providing. You do this literally in a table format. I state the objective, I write it out, I list the activities that are going to take place in chronological order, put together a column for the timeline, when each activity is going to happen, and in another column, who is going to undertake that activity. Eventually, you look at these activities, and activities can be translated into items of cost. Is it going to be a staff person? Is it going to be, supplies and materials? Is it going to be facility rental? So that leads us to the next section that Rachel's going to talk about, creating the budget and your organizational financials.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about budgets and financials. Workshop 1, we actually got a lot of questions around putting together budgets, how to work in overhead, things like that. So hopefully this section will address a lot of those. And also from the first workshop, we also had a question I remember about like ordering of components. So we're giving you all these tools and where to put in different sections if a funder doesn't specifically ask for them. So we'll be giving some examples and going through the common grant application, which is one potential model for how to order a proposal, but there's the point of us giving you toolkit chunks is also that you can reorder them and use them in different ways. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So first and foremost, it's really important to start with the understanding that budgets and financials are also value statements. So we've talked a lot about how to convey things that are important to your organization when applying for a grant, how to use the right kind of language to convey to a funder what's important to you, and also how a funder conveys that to you and your organization as an applicant. So numbers and data are as much value statements as the narratives that we write and the way that we talk about our work. So you can, actually, we won't go on quite yet, there you go. So you can ask yourself while thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion ideas, can you look at your own organizational budget and see those kinds of values reflected? And we'll kind of talk through ways to sort of see that in numbers, because your budget really does convey, do you support your staff well? Do you care about investing in future programming or just focused on the day-to-day? And if you get to know how to look for those values in your own financials and budgets, you'll also be able to see them in funders' financials as well, right? You always kind of want to be researching the funder at the same time they're digging into your application. And just to give a couple examples by way of introduction, if you pay attention to the news, you'll see a lot of stories. Usually it's around calling out or sort of whistleblowing on companies, but really what they get called out on is usually something that has been discovered in their budget or in their financials. So you might read about an organization that serves children's health initiatives, but you look at their financial statements and their investments and realize that a good chunk of their long-term investments are part of that portfolio is big tobacco or some other industry that doesn't really align with their mission and values. Environmental groups are often looking at their investment portfolios to see if they're actually investing in fossil fuel industries or things that they're actually trying to dismantle as part of their mission and vision for their work. And a really famous one a number of years ago was a nonprofit that supported veterans and was probably the most prominent, well-known veterans support nonprofit. And a whistleblower leaked financial documents that showed that a huge percentage of its operating budgets was going to private flights and big parties for donors, wealthy donors and trustees of the organization. Oh, and Patricia, I just see dropped into the chat box something really important. The fund is a great organization that has really modeled how to make sure its financials represent its mission. So the fund has completely divested from fossil fuels. So that's also something that I hope we see more and more of, especially in the current climate, is organizations, you know, looking at their own financials and making sure that those values line up. So a wonderful thing to sort of keep in mind as we talk through what sometimes is the, you know, more boring components of how to put together the numbers, but they definitely, these mean something. These are value statements. So, all right, on the next slide, we'll just look briefly, give an overview of different types of budgets and financial documents that you might be asked for in a grant application. Not all of them will ask for all of these, but it's good to be familiar with the different kinds. So the first is an organizational budget. So this is the big picture of your organization. What does it take to actually operate? And that's usually, you know, the big things like staffing, the rent for your office, right? It's an all-encompassing budget, and program budgets that we'll talk about a lot will be sort of part of your organizational budget. The other term that you'll see a lot is organizational financials. So that's different than your operating budget, which is the organizational budget. The financials help create a more comprehensive picture of your organization related to its finances. So how is your cash flow? How much, it's a good indicator of how much risk you can take. So if an organization, say, paying your staff and keeping the lights on costs $10,000 a month, hopefully it's more than that if you're paying your staff, but how many months of cash flow do you have? So if no more funds came in, if you stopped fundraising, would you be able to last for 3 to 6 months? And I think this current year, the year of a pandemic, I think a lot of people have sort of looked at those different parts of financials to look at the fiscal health of an organization. And also in the financials is where you see whether or not an organization's income and expenses zero out. So if you are a nonprofit organization, that's an indicator, right? Your budget is supposed to balance. But kind of the way we want to bring in the questions of overhead, this is an important part I just like to throw in, that nonprofits can turn a profit. Nonprofit is a tax designation. It's not a business model. And so if you turn a profit, meaning you fundraise $8 million, but your programs and expenses only total $6 million, you've made an extra $2 million that year. That doesn't stop you from being a nonprofit or get you in trouble. It just means you have $2 million to reinvest in all of your future programming. So those are the kinds of things that you'll see on organizational financial statements. Audited financials. This is something that it's a particular kind of financials that you would pay a firm, an external CPA firm, to come in and do a third-party overview and audit of your financials. And these are generally only required of organizations that are of a certain size. So if you have, it's different tax levels. If you have more than $200,000 of raised income or $2 million, you kind of, the requirements are slightly different. So smaller organizations probably don't have audited financials, and that some funders will ask for them, but there's always an option to explain why you don't have them or why they wouldn't be required for you. And in terms of what we'll spend a good chunk of the rest of this section talking about, really comes down to program budgets, sort of how to create a program budget for your for your organization for a particular grant application. So all these other types of documents might be required for that application, but the main program for which you're applying for that grant is what's going to be contained within the program budget. And then generally it's a project plan that comes down to numbers. So just like the activities and the timeline that Suzanne just spoke about, your program budget tells that same story, but in numbers. Sort of who are the main people doing the work and how much does that cost? If your timeline, you know, what are the supplies needed and how much does that cost? So it's telling that same story, but through the dollar amounts that are required. And then the last kind of document you might be asked for is a budget narrative. So this is another section in prose. So you'll actually be writing out full sentences explaining why you arrived at the budget numbers that are in your budget. So if you say in your budget, staffing, $50,000, they might require a budget narrative that actually explains how many hours of work for how many people at what kind of hourly rate. What formulas did you use to come up with those numbers that are in the budget? So that's what the budget narrative is. All right, so we'll get back to a couple of the other bigger, more broad kinds of financial documents, but for now, we're gonna look at how do you even build a budget? So how do you get started thinking about building your budget? And ultimately, this begins with, I think, what we had as part of our homework, which was listing off the kinds of expenses, the things that cost your organization money. So if you're starting from scratch, that's kind of a list, you know, who do we have working for us? What kinds of office supplies do we need? What kinds of program costs? And thinking back to Suzanne's section on activities, this is a great place to sort of kickstart the brainstorming if you don't know where to start. Look at your activities and your timeline, and almost everything in that is going to have a cost associated with it. So you can let your activities guide your budgeting for that particular program. And sometimes what's required of a certain activity is not necessarily cash money. It could be someone's time, which you might pay them or you might not have to pay them. You'll hear this, we like to say this a lot, that sometimes what you're asking for, what you need, is not really money. You need what money can buy, or you need to know the monetary equivalent of what someone is contributing to you. So general categories when you start from scratch would be staffing, supplies, sometimes there's travel. A lot of our county-wide work requires staff to drive long distances, so things like travel costs and gas. There's equipment, and then there's this mysterious category called overhead, and we'll talk a bit more about how that factors in. The main two things to think about with kinds of expenses are whether or not something is a direct cost or an indirect cost. And a direct cost is something that can be tracked and associated with a specific project activity. An indirect cost is sometimes used as a synonym for overhead. It's a kind of expense that is shared across different projects or different programs or activities. It can be a cost that's necessary for operations of your organization, but not specifically linked to a particular activity in your proposal timeline. And within that, people often ask how you determine an indirect cost or an indirect cost rate. And oftentimes there's a percentage that a funder will give you. So they'll say, tell us the project, your project budget, and we allow for a 5% indirect cost rate or a 10% indirect cost rate. And the usefulness of that is that you say, okay, it cost me $9,000 to run this program. And the funder is saying, we'll actually let you ask for an extra $900, an extra 10% of that just for a cushion to assume that there are other costs associated with running that program for $9,000, whether that's a telephone, you know, to call people related to that program, or keeping the lights on in the office that runs that program. Sometimes it's getting better. Sometimes you'll see, we think we talked about this during workshop 1, you'll see some funders who are inching up that percentage cap up to 15% sometimes. And if you ever get into the point where you're going after federal grants, federal granting agencies will actually let you negotiate with them a rate that works better for your organization. And an example of how you might get a really high indirect cost rate would be if you're doing, it happens a lot in health industries, if you have lots of staff doing research or things like that, you're pretty much, your entire organization is almost salaries and benefits for the people doing work. And so that might mean that your indirect cost rate that could cover salaries and benefits would be higher. It's important to understand also the distinction between program-specific costs and organizational costs. So some examples of the program-specific costs might be supplies to run a summer camp for the population that you serve. So supplies like sleeping bags and food and things like that for that program. The organizational costs could be the fundraising team that goes out and asks people for scholarships for kids to attend that summer camp, or the financial team that does the back end financial work of receiving payments from parents to send their kids to that summer camp. So there's the program costs, and then the other costs related to the operation of your organization. So this pie chart that's on the slide right now is a very, very simple breakdown of 100% of an organizational budget. So this one looks roughly to be about 80% or so is programs. And then you've got this little sliver that says admin and fundraising. So the admin is that financial team, the fundraising, they're doing your fundraising. So this is total separation, right? It's a separated budget saying programs are all over here, and admin and fundraising and keeping the lights on and everything like that is over here. It's a really limited kind of budget, right? It's very simple, and if you start asking questions about budgets, it's clearly too simple. So what's the alternative? And the kind of budget we want to encourage you to think about producing is better pictured in the next slide, which shows a comprehensive budget, okay? So this is the kind of budget we actually want to think about building. In this budget, indirect costs, so keeping the lights on, is shared across programs, right? Because it's not just, the summer camp can't operate without the main office still being able to function. So if you have a summer camp and an after school camp, both of those are going to rely on the main office still functioning, right? So that main office cost, the utilities, the salaries of those people, that's actually shared across your programs, because they both of them need that to work. So that's indirect costs being shared across programs. Direct costs can also be shared across programs. So a direct cost of a van that transports kids between camps or between school and an after school program. That's a direct cost. Sometimes programs will share the same space or make use of the same equipment. So those are direct costs that also need to be thought of as shared. So this other model, the comprehensive model, it still reflects program-specific costs and operational costs, right? So you have direct expenses on the outside that are program-specific. The next layer is shared direct expenses. Then you go into the core mission support. So what it's labeling there is that finance team, your human resources team, and even your, like, if you have a board of directors, the costs associated with supporting that, because even your board of directors does work supporting them also supports the overall operations of your programs and your organization. And then at the center is that core mission support, oftentimes fundraising. This is where fundraising will lie, because rather than being a separate piece of that pie, fundraising is, for most nonprofits, a core function that allows everything else to work, right? If you're not bringing in the funds, none of the programs can operate. So what this doesn't mean, and it's important to kind of stress this, is this doesn't mean that indirect costs can just be arbitrarily lumped in with your project budgets. So you can't say, oh, well, I have this program, I'm just going to put my entire utility bill in that program. Funders will recognize that not every single use of that utility is devoted to that one program. So you want to be thoughtful about it and say, well, if that person devotes 10% of their time to summer camp and 20% of their time to the after school program, then the budget should reflect those percentages across certain programs. Okay, so again, that's a good reminder that budgets are value statements, right? And what you're conveying to a funder through your budgets is really important. It speaks to what you think is important. We talked about that in the Q&A last week, how incorporating overhead thoughtfully is a great way to indicate to funders that overhead costs are important. Investing in staff, investing in the right kind of infrastructure is important. Nonprofits, many of them can't function without software and different kinds of non-tangible equipment like that, like a donor database. And funders would often consider that to be an indirect cost and might not want to support it. But really you can't, the core functions can't work without something like good software or good systems like that in place. All right, next slide, please. So what is that bigger picture of the why build a total cost budget? The first one is pretty simple. You can't ask for what you can't show. So even with an organization like the fund that gives you a lot of technical support and encourages you to have conversations with them about what you need, if you can't actually put together a budget or show it in numbers, even the most flexible of funders are going to have follow-up questions for you. What a good budget does is it really demonstrates to the funder that you have a mastery over your own organization, that you understand some of these unwritten rules of grant seeking, right? You understand that numbers matter. You understand that the numbers you present are value statements. So it really helps convey, even if you have a wonderful proposal and this beautiful narrative already laid out, having a solid budget really, really just underscores the strength of a proposal, because it's a place where the people reviewing the proposal are going to look to see if you kind of can back up what you just told them with good financials and a good financial understanding. I definitely, I love the funds model of the grant making committee because that system really allows us to help organizations with their budgets. I think everyone on the grant making committee has a different part of an application that maybe they tend to focus on more. I think probably the three of us presenting here tend to be the ones that really do look at budgets. And a lot of the conversations brought up around that committee table have to do with, does this organization really feel or really understand what it costs? Because sometimes, because that's also part of the fund model is to help, we will often go to an organization and say, we actually think you asked for too little. And we're wondering how you're covering overhead if you haven't asked us for it, or sort of asking those follow-up questions is really important. Again, to reiterate, a total cost budget really helps you incorporate overhead into direct costs in an appropriate way. So understanding that yes, your phone bill for the year can and should be allocated to kind of a percentage for each aspect of your organization's operations, and that's appropriate. If a funder is really interested in a program of yours, they should also be interested in the indirect costs that support that program. So a total cost budget really conveys that in a strong way. Also things like in-kind resources. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Not everything that you need has a price tag that requires cash. So sometimes you'll have a supporter who, say, donates that van that you need to transport kids between school and an after-school program. So they haven't given you $30,000 to buy a van, they've actually given you the van itself. So that's an in-kind donation. It's a non-cash resource that's been given to you. And that can be indicated in a budget. We'll see how in-kind contributions are listed on the Common Grant application budget a little bit later. And also things like volunteer hours, where a lot of us, I think, here work for smaller organizations where a lot of the time people give to doing the work of the organization is volunteer. And in a budget, it is perfectly appropriate to include the value of volunteer hours. And if you rely on 20 hours a week of someone driving that van and they don't charge you because they want to make it a contribution, that's also something that if they weren't there, you would have to pay someone else to do. So it should be in that budget. Again, it conveys that you understand all the ins and outs of that if you didn't have an in-kind resource, you'd have to pay for it some other way. And also in terms of value statements, I like to include when talking about volunteer hours, some funders, states, school districts, different industries will have a sort of set number for what they want to see volunteer hours valued at. And I remember I wrote an application once, I can't remember the specific industry, but they set volunteer hours as being worth $20 an hour. Which is great, right? That's like, so that adds up to like a pretty decent chunk of your budget that you're getting covered by volunteer hours. But when you looked at staffing, they were only paying staff, $13 an hour. So I thought, that was a really interesting way, again, that budgets show value statements. Why would a volunteer be worth more than your paid staff? So those are things to think about when you're putting together a total cost budget, to also see if the person reviewing that budget were to do that math, would you like what it would show them about your organization, that you somehow value, one person's time over another person's time. So be thoughtful about that as when you account for those things. And then finally, a total cost budget really helps if you are applying to a funder who requires matching amounts of contribution, or if you have to demonstrate cost sharing. So the subtle difference between those two, matching funds is generally cash or non-cash, could be in-kind contributions that generally the organization you're applying for funds from them, they'll say, we require a 50% match, meaning we want to make sure that you're also contributing cash and resources into this project. A lot of funders do not want to fund the entire cost of a project. They want to know that other people are also invested in that. So when you're asked for a match, it's either cash you have, in-kind resources you already have, and it can also be other funders. So individual donors, another foundation, public funding that helps you make up that match. So if you have a total cost budget that includes a really, full accounting of in-kind resources, volunteer hours, equipment that's been donated, that helps you meet that match, right? So that you don't have to come up with it all in cash. Cost sharing is slightly different. Cost sharing is just an indication that you have a partner in the work that you're doing. So if two organizations are coming together to run this the same program, they would both be contributing, you know, different amounts to that project. So that's cost sharing. And again, it can be cash or in kind usually with that. I think, yeah, so with cost sharing and matching, usually so my organization is a higher education foundation. And so when we have to come up with matching funds, we usually do it with things like salaries. So the college is already committed to paying the salary of a faculty member who is involved in a project. So since the college is already paying that, we can use that as part of our match for, say, a federal grant. So we want $5,000 for equipment from the federal government, and what we're matching that with is $5,000 that we already have for that faculty member's salary. So that's just a couple examples of how that works. And I also bring this up in the context of really building out good budgets, because I think matching requirements often scare people away from applying to certain funders. And if you are already paying your utility bills and already paying your staff, that's potential matching money, right? So you still have to be thoughtful about it, and you can't just arbitrarily kind of assign certain things to match other things, but it's important not to shy away from applications that require matching or cost sharing, because you might actually be in a better position for that than you think you are. And creating a really good budget helps you see that. All right, next category, next slide, is just a couple different categories. So really this is just to let you know that every budget might be different in what it expects to see in your expense categories. So generally speaking, you're going to have staffing, which would be direct and indirect costs, program costs, so direct costs primarily, your overhead, which is primarily indirect costs, and in-kind resources. If you apply to a federal or state agency, they probably have very particular categories that they will tell you they want you to fit your budget into. Salaries, benefits, they usually break out. Equipment is something that costs more than $5,000. Supplies are things that cost less than $5,000 each. And then they'll break out things like travel, consultants, construction. But also to expect that other funders might let it all be self-determined. They might have only 2 budget categories they want you to fit everything into, or they might just let you determine what your categories are. So just to keep that in mind, you want to be flexible with kind of the ways you can creatively think about your own budgets so that you can make those fit with whatever the funder is requesting of you at a given time. And then on that note, we're going to look now at the common grant application. And to sort of look at what one template that is very valuable in our county in particular sort of deals with this. So wanted to do a quick poll, make sure I haven't lost people with the boring budget talk yet. But since it was part of your homework, we're just curious to hear from you at this point, how many of you were able to find the common grant application online just by searching for it. So if you want to check out our poll and answer quickly. We will, it's anonymous, I think, no judgment if you have to pick that third option, but we're just curious. Give that a little bit of time. Yes, judgment-free zone. We give homework, but you know, we understand.
Give it just another minute or so. Thanks so much for weighing in, everybody. Okay, time for the big reveal.
Big reveal. All right, that's fair. Okay, so of the ones who attempted, that's interesting. Okay, so about twice as many people as couldn't find it did end up finding it. So thank you for being honest as well. If you chose the third option there, as we start looking at the Common Grant application, I think if he hasn't already, Stanley's going to drop the PDF into the chat box. So if you didn't have a chance to find it, we want you to open the PDF on your computer screen if possible, because as I move forward through the slides on this section, there are screenshots, but they're going to be really small on the presentation slides. You're not going to be able to read them. So if you found them in your homework, pull them up now, or it looks like Stanley's dropping them into the chat as well. So we'll give that a little bit of time. And really, I mean, while we're getting this figured out, the reason I wanted to do the poll is that, you know, part of the mission, the vision behind the Common Grant application is that it's an accessible way to help organizations create a toolkit, create an application template that can be used at lots of different funders. So the idea is that it's a helpful tool. And that also means, you know, we want it to be easily found online. And as we talk through that more, we'll go through kind of the list of funders that use the Common Grant application. And you can generally find it on all of their individual websites. So if they have a website and they use it, they'll have a link to it. And the other place to find it easily is the Santa Barbara Foundation's website. So if you go there, even if you just Google Santa Barbara Foundation Common Grant application, you should get a direct link to that PDF. Okay, so were you able to find it online? Some of us were, some of us not. And then basically, what is this and why are we guiding you to use it? So, oh, actually just stay on we can go back to the intro slide first before we get to those pages. I don't want you to struggle to read it until necessary. So the Common Grant application, it is a template. It is something that we wanted to direct you to as part of this workshop series, because we, back in the spring, when we were talking about what was happening with the fund for Santa Barbara's cycles this year, because of the pandemic, we actually ended up canceling the fund's fall grant cycle. So that we could focus more on emerging needs grants and things that were really responsive to what was coming out of a lot of the current events of 2020. So we wanted to be able to provide something like this workshop to organizations so that they can try to find funding from other funders. So that's why we wanted to direct you to that and spend some time going through this. It's also, it is a time to give a shout out to the Foundation Roundtable. So the Foundation Roundtable is a group of funders in our county who meet regularly to talk about issues around grant making and philanthropy in our county. And they decided, they came up with this application template, and many foundations within the roundtable agreed to use it so that they could all be accessible to applicants and in the same way. So really, you know, who is it for? It's for any applicants to these foundations, but it's also something for them to discuss how foundations really should be, you know, on the same page about how they're asking applicants to create proposals. Because when we're talking about influencing philanthropy through grant applications, the Foundation Roundtable here in our county, that's one of the audiences that we are trying to influence, right? That we are wanting to call into conversation around grants and how grant making and grant seeking is done in our community in particular. Another part of the why is certainly that these are just useful building blocks. So we're going to go through the pages, and a lot of the questions that you'll see in the Common Grant application are directly getting at the components that, that Suzanne and Jen have already gone through in this workshop. So these are building blocks. These questions allow you to create those building blocks. They might be slightly different than other funders, but at least for this group of funders, you'll be able to know that these building blocks will be useful for a number of different applications. And then finally, there are some specific financial pages on the Common Grant application. So if you don't have financials, you can use these templates to start creating your own financial documents. So it's really useful on that. And as we go through, just a note again, as we look at these pages, to keep in mind things like the DEI standards, anti-racism, intentional use of language that we've been reminding you about. We're going to see some of the language use in the Common Grant application, and as always, it's a chance to kind of be thoughtful about the way that our organizations respond to those questions. All right, so the next page is the first 3 pages of the Common Grant application. So again, hopefully you have it up on your computer, because this is really not very legible at this size, but the intro page kind of tells you a little bit about the Foundation Roundtable and what their why is for creating it. The bottom of the form, if you can't see it, I'll point it out, does direct you to the fund if you're looking for a Spanish version of the Common Grant application. So the Foundation Roundtable definitely talks about accessibility, and in our county in particular, that means language accessibility. So there is a Spanish version of this form available. A couple times throughout, you'll see they note that every foundation that uses this does have its own specifications and definitely its own deadlines and things. So you do need to pay attention to individual instructions that might come from the organization you're applying for funds from. And the list of funders on the first page, so this is, you'll see at this bottom half of the page there is the list of foundations that accept this application. So spend some time Googling those foundations, doing a little research, seeing if their mission aligns with the work that you do. And just by this alone, you'll have, hopefully, a list of potential funders. And you'll know that when you put together a basic application for one of them, it will work for the others. The second page that you'll see on this slide is the application checklist. It's always really convenient to have a checklist so you can check your work at the end. And again, I think they reiterate at the bottom of this page to check with the individual funders for what they require. And then also they've got a little section at the bottom that is strategies for successful grant seeking. And so some of the things reiterated there are things you've heard about in this workshop, but it's also that to me is an indication that the people who created this form, it tells me something about their values in terms of wanting to support grant seekers in a way that is really nice and short and sweet and condensed into this template, but they are thinking about, giving you tips. And then the third one is the cover sheet. So this is basically just the basic information about your organization, address, contact info. The one thing I wanted to point out on this page is the part that says type of request. So the kinds of support that you're looking for. And there's a lot on here, and we haven't talked about all of them. So general support, program support, seed funding, research, multi-year, capital, endowment, or other. So this just kind of shows you the breadth of what all these different foundations have or will support. So you would select which one, and that would also determine what kind of budget you put together would be what type of support you select on this cover page. And generally, it will be very clear what the organization wants you to apply for. So some on this list really only support program. Some only support general operating or capital. So do your research on which foundation you're applying for that section. And then at the next little section of this, you'll just state your mission statement. So it's always good to have a super short and simple mission statement. And also, it requests a brief summary of the funding request. And it's not a very big space. So we'll talk a little bit about word limits. You don't have a lot of space on this form, so you need to be able to condense your request down to a really short kind of 1 or 2 sentences is about what fits in this text block. Character counts and word counts are going to vary immensely in grant applications, but the Common Grant application is a fillable PDF, so you'll be limited to basically this space. And if you do add your additional pages, like for the narrative, they'll also give you the guidelines for that. And then the very bottom of the cover sheet is proposal authorization. And I think this is an interesting section to point out because they want to see that your executive director and also a board member have seen this application and know that you're going after these funds. So it's a way to look at if you have the buy-in from your own institution. So that's important. All right, next slide. The next 2 pages. The one on the right, the board of directors governing body, it's a really simple one. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it's just a list of your board, and then they want to know how many times your board meets per year. And that's really just to make sure you've got some, governance in place. Small, even really small organizations should have at least the minimum amount of board members. The proposal narrative, this is the meat of your application, and this will be the part that's not in the form fillable PDF. It'll be something you'll produce in a Word document or create your own PDF. Right at the top, you'll see these are some explicit rules, page limits, margins, and fonts. So definitely pay attention, like we talked about in the unwritten rules section of workshop 1. You don't want to give them an excuse to discard your application. And earlier we saw there was a question that came up in the chat box about how to condense a statement of need into a short paragraph if you're only allowed a certain amount of space. That's an excellent question. And I wish I had an easier answer, but really it's crafting that paragraph and then condensing it down to whatever page limit or word limit the funder gives you. And it's a good practice to have a description of your project that is 50 words, 100 words, 250 words, and maybe 500 words. And then you'll do that and you'll go to an application and it'll say your limit is 1,000 characters with spaces, which I don't know off the top of my head how many words that is. But the key with that is you're always going to have to be editing, expanding, and condensing. And that's just kind of, the nature of grant applications, unfortunately. So the proposal narrative is broken out into 2 pieces, background and funding requests, and then it gives you prompt questions for how to provide that information. So background is, this is great to have these blurbs on hand because these will work also for other types of funding requests and fundraising even with individuals, and writing appeal letters, which is your organization's history and accomplishments, all the current programs and activities that you do. So even if you're writing an application for one program, this background section actually wants to hear about all of your programs and the overarching objectives and activities of the whole organization. This will also contain some demographic information because sometimes the organization will serve a broad general demographic, but the application you're writing for a specific program has a much narrower demographic it serves. So these will be different. And then organizational relationships. So these are, who are your partners in the community? And not everyone will ask, not all other funders will ask for this section, but it's an interesting, it's a good, good blurb to have for your organization. And then the narrative funding request, that's all the components that Jen and Suzanne have gone through. They ask them in slightly different ways here on the Common Grant application, but you should be able to see the commonalities of how your building blocks that we've already talked about will fit into this. And just to quickly call attention, in number 3 under funding requests, you'll see they ask for your target audience. So, right, the discussions we've been having about language, we're trying not to use the word target when it applies to people. We can use target as a synonym for things like milestones or goals, but it definitely has a more negative and even violent connotation when it's applied to people and bodies. So, right, they use this language in the application prompts, but that doesn't mean you have to use it when you're describing your programs back to them. So subtle changes in language there. And then the 5th question I'll just call attention to quickly: how do you plan to evaluate the effectiveness or impact of your project? That is what we will spend almost the entire workshop 3 talking about. Is evaluation and success measures. So this is that part of your narrative where you talk about what success looks like to you, which gives you the opportunity to really convey to the funder how you want to measure success, and then lay out what your evaluation plan is. So that section we're going to spend a lot of time on in workshop 3. And then there's also a request for the summary of skills for relevant staff members. So that's, I think that question did come up in workshop 1 as well, that like you could incorporate that just as easily in question 3 above, which is describing your project. So if they don't specifically ask about your staffing, but you want to talk about the program lead, you can put that into a general description of the program just as easily as, you know, having it in a separate question. And then if full funding is not available, question 7 asks about your contingency plans. And even if a funder doesn't ask this question, it's a really good exercise to answer it for your project. If you don't get full funding, what will you do? Will the project go away? Or will you be able to downsize it? Or would you find other sources of funding? And this is a part where I want to encourage people to not allow that deficit mindset that we've talked about to apply to you as an organization. You don't need to also be putting yourself in the position of begging and really emphasizing how needy you are as an organization. A funder will actually very much want to see that you have contingency plans, that you've been thoughtful about it, and that you can proceed by going after other funds or by modifying your program. So don't be afraid to answer this question honestly when you're preparing these applications. All right, next slide. We'll wrap this up in the next couple minutes. So this is the project budget page. So this is where you can actually, all the types of expenses and things that you've come up with, you just plug them into this table. It's important to note they want to see income as well as expenses. So all of your budget categories at the bottom, but then they also want to see who is paying for this. And one of the lines in that income section will be the name of the funder you're applying to. So if you're sending this off to the Tobes Foundation, you would put source, Tobes Foundation, what you're requesting from them, and in the notes section, put this request. So it's sort of also good practice to feel like you're gonna win the grant before you apply. Go ahead and put that into your income, because that is part of your project plan, is winning the grant that you're writing. The income and expenses should zero out. If not, they'll want an explanation. You don't want to say you're bringing in $150,000 for a project that only costs $100,000, because then they'll wonder why you need their $20K if you're already planning to over fundraise. So you do want them to sort of even out. And then there's notes sections. So there's sections for you to add some explanations. And this is a good sheet. If you have multiple projects, it's easy for you to just have this common grant application page for each of them. All right, and then the last slide is just the 2 financial pages of the Common Grant application. So one is the organizational financial summary, the other one is the balance sheet summary. And these give a snapshot in time of the fiscal circumstance of the organization. That's why you'll see in the far right column on the first page and the first column of the second one, it says as of, and you put in the date. And that would be the date of that your accountant or your controller, who would be the one filling out these documents, would say, as of June 30th, this is the state of our budget and our income and expenses. And these are for the entire organization, not project specific. So you'll want to work with your accounting team or an external accountant you work with to help fill these out. So these also help if you don't have a full audited financial statement every year. If you can maintain even these 2 documents, it'll help you. I've used these pages from the Common Grant application as financial documents for other funders. So if you can, we update ours quarterly with these. So if you can keep up with these 2 documents, that really helps have those required financials, even if you don't have audited financials or larger, kind of more official financial pages. These are official as well. You don't want to make up these 2 pages. Really work with your business office, your accountant, your controller, because these are about your assets and liabilities and some very specific categories of funding. So, all right, that was a lot of financial information and budgets. So we are now going to go to Q&A, I believe. Thank you for those of you who put things in the Q&A box or in the chat, and I think Stanley's going to organize them for us to jump into.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. I myself am taking notes, learning a ton, even as I've been here to organize our workshop. So now we're going to open it up to Rachel, to Jennifer, and Suzanne to answer some of the wonderful questions that we had. And just as a reminder, again, we will get to what we can and address any outstanding questions next week, where we'll have a bit more time for Q&A. So I know that you answered some of these as you went along, Rachel. We had one question around about language from Angelina. So what type of language is best? Academic language specific to the data and research you're presenting, or common language that is used professionally? Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of the rhetoric used in the tone for applications?
I can take a lead on this one. So this is kind of tricky to answer because it depends on who you're writing to. So a lot of the times with more of like family foundations or community foundations, you don't have to be as formal as with maybe like a government grant, where formality and like straightforwardness is key, right? Because that's kind of more of what government grants want. However, what I will say is that you always want to make sure that you don't get too academic, because then you lose your reader. And then you also don't really emphasize the storytelling as much. So it's just not as interesting of a proposal. So it's kind of sort of a really fine line that's kind of tricky. It's kind of tricky, and there's not a clear answer. At the end of the day, whatever language you're using should clearly state whatever it is that your need statement is, or whatever it is that your objectives are, or that your activities are. And your reader shouldn't get lost in like, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? And any language you're using that your reader might not know, you want to define. And remember that the person, you're the expert on this, right? And so you know everything about it. And so you think that what you're saying makes sense. So it's always good to have someone who doesn't know the program or read it, so that they can be like, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? you know, because we tend to get really like into the not the weeds, but we can get really technical in program language and then not realize that our reader's not going to understand that.
Yeah, just to underscore that, absolutely right. I mean, you always want to avoid using jargon. In higher ed, I have to remind myself of that all the time because we have so many acronyms that we take for granted that other people do not know what all those acronyms mean. And there's always language specific to your area, and you just want to make sure you explain it. Like, I think being direct and explaining yourself is always good, whether it's formal or informal language. And I mean, I always joke, I am very much an academic at heart, and I am terrible at writing annual appeal letters because I want to fill them with data and I want to talk about, you know, the big picture societal change. And the reality is, in that kind of writing situation, you want feel good stories. You want qualitative snippets that make a donor feel good about what they're contributing to. And so, yeah, like as Jen said, a family foundation might be more like an appeal letter. You want to make it personal, and then a federal application might want to see a little bit more rigorous use of data. Yeah, so it's always going to be different, unfortunately.
Great, and Patricia also added in, you know, staying away from fluffing up the proposal with repetitive, kind of flowery language, which I think is great advice as well. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to a question from Molly. If your organization has its own version of a balance sheet, is it okay to submit what is already made or, you know, pre-formatted, or would they rather see you fit your budget into this format? Any other tips and tricks about, like, you know, using what you have, but also meeting the criteria for an application?
I'm guessing that question has to do with like an organization that's asking for the common grant application, but those financial pages are different. So I think my experience is yes, but I can't speak for all the foundations on that list, because you're right, those are templates based on conventional financials. So sometimes there are pages from our audited financials that I will just swap in because it's already done. Especially if I'm wanting a June 30th version and our finance team is really busy with the next audit. But I think it's always just best to check with the funder to make sure. But you're right, a balance sheet summary and like those are pretty standard accounting documents. So you might have a slightly different version if you use QuickBooks or a different software too.
Yeah. Yeah, usually the funder will tell you if it's okay or if it's not okay for you to submit your own forms.
Okay, let's turn inward a little bit now with a question from Athena. It's an easy one. Is the fund working on challenging measurable outcomes as a standard in grant proposals and progress reports? I was in a webinar recently on challenging white supremacy and philanthropy, where measurable outcomes were mentioned many times as one element of grant making that makes it difficult for grassroots, locally nuanced racial justice projects to get funded. Thoughts? How are we doing?
I think this is a really challenging piece that we do intend to address in the next workshop, how you measure progress in social justice work. And even though I talked a lot about setting milestones and targets that are measurable in writing your objective statements, you know, it's always helpful to have the data to know how you've accomplished what you've accomplished so far, and do you have the data to back that up? You know how many people you serve, you know how well they do in the program. These are important things. But for myself, I also want to emphasize the value of qualitative components that go into these measures, as it were. When I wrote grant proposals, I frequently did focus groups with the populations that were going to be the beneficiaries of the service at the college I worked at. And I did focus groups with faculty as well to get their perspectives. And both before and after and during the program. So I think that there's a variety of ways of being able to look at that continuum of change and establish milestones. As I said, they're approximations, and you can talk about your accomplishments along that continuum.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will definitely dive into that in workshop 3. Like, what does it mean to, create your own versions and ideas for how to collect quantitative data if you think that that's what's required, but qualitative can become quantitative in the way you tell that story. And one of the examples I always think of is in higher ed, especially in recent years, a lot of the metrics, even around like large scale Department of Education grants that we have gone after, are around the sense of students feeling belonging on campus, right? I mean, how do you quantify belonging? It's emotional. And so there are methods, I think, focus groups and that sort of, there's ways to talk about that, that still fits the criteria of funders that think they want data. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll give some more thought. I'm glad this question came up now, because now we'll really think about our discussions in workshop 3 with that lens.
I will add though that, we, like, even in this conversation, just to call the group in, we're still talking about how you can, still have measurable outcomes that in the first place. And I think it's, to be super straightforward, no, grants, sorry, it says my internet is unstable. Did I break up? Okay, where did I leave off?
Do you want to repeat just, you mentioned kind of to call in the group,
Okay.
and then
to call the group in, I think we are still, even in addressing this question, talking about how to, use what you have to show measurable outcomes, whereas I think this is more about eradicating them entirely. And so just to be super straightforward, no, the grants world overall is not there yet. And these are conversations that are coming up, and this is some of the, like, in our DEI framework that I established in the first workshop, like, there's still all of these limitations. And again, DEI is not social justice. It's not a synonym for social justice. It's a strategy to help us get there, but it is a corporate strategy. So there's lots of limitations. So I think the answer is no. And I think that this is a great challenge for the fund and for Patricia and Stanley to kind of think about as we look at the application for the fund, right? Like how what's the word I'm looking for? Like, how much are we actually pushing the envelope? I mean, we do quite a bit to talk with our grantees, but like, what would happen if we eliminated the need for measurable outcomes in our grant application, right? Like, these are really broader questions, and I think that they're coming up in every facet of everything as a result of the current climate and everything that's happening socially. But it's gonna take some work to get, I mean, the grant system, as Rachel talked about, even in the first presentation, it's flawed. There's a lot of inherent oppression in the way grants are set up. So I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that really helped.
Yeah, I would like to add that in the third workshop next week, we will provide a handout from the work that Manuel Pastor at UCSB does. That's just about this, that he does a lot of work on, evaluating progress toward social change. And I think we have a handout that kind of diagrams some of his work, his suggestions.
Yeah, and I think also, I think we're going to have it to the resource list. There is, I believe it's an article from the Chronicle of Philanthropy about equity work and evaluation measures, and basically how evaluation measures just don't make sense and often actively undermine equity initiatives. So that's an interesting article. And then, I mean, even after conversations we had with some of you after last week's workshop, we've talked about that, like, maybe there's a brown bag series in the fund's future where we talk about these bigger pictures around how to actually shift philanthropy and these underlying assumptions. Because I think what I didn't have time to talk about in the first workshop in that section is there is an alternative to this, and people are starting to create a model for what I think most people kind of call it now trust-based philanthropy. So in a way, it's sort of recreating the philanthropic system to be much more relational. It's part of it is every grant and every gift would be unrestricted. So you don't have to justify your program budgets. It's all unrestricted because the funder trusts that your organization knows how to solve the problems it's seeking to solve. So if you wanted to do, I mean, if anyone, just some internet research, and I'm curious which webinar actually Athena was talking about, because I'd be curious to listen to that, but look up trust-based philanthropy and the sort of models and tenets that come out of that. Because it's, I mean, ironically, trust-based philanthropy is right now it's a theoretical kind of academic model, but it lays out what that alternative could look like. And I think, as Jen said, this year especially, I think is encouraging all of us to reimagine, right? Nobody wants to go back to the way things were. The new normal is not going to be the way things were. And so I would love for the fund, I mean, it makes sense for the fund to be the sort of thought leader in that conversation as well.
And Stanley, also, you may recall that I put a paper in our resource file that perhaps you can send out to the participants on that topic.
That's right.
Yeah.
Jen?
Also, I just want to say that they're like, again, acknowledging the reality that a lot of, a lot of us, and I'm a millennial, and a lot of millennials and older generations are kind of like in this framework of like, we need to change the system. And then there's Gen Zers, and they do not fuck around. I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, but they are like, we don't need to work within the systems. We need to eradicate them completely. So I think that these themes are going to keep coming up. And I mean, some younger millennials as well also think that way, like me. But I also work within the system, so I kind of go back and forth a little bit. So just an acknowledgement that this is going to, like, systems are going to change.
Let's dismantle philanthropy. It's as simple as that.
Yes. So one thing that, well, I think this is all really valuable conversation too, and necessary and overdue reflection for the sector. I know at the fund, and Patricia read my mind in the chat box as well. I know at the fund, one thing that we do kind of to push back on some of these norms is that our questions to applicants is to really measure their own success. So, as a funder, we don't know what success looks like, and we don't pretend to or want to know, or pretend to be the expert. So we definitely ask applicants to really determine what success is, and then make sort of reporting really minimal. It's a one-page kind of update on your work. So those are some of the steps that we're taking, right? And also just open to feedback, right? And just kind of constantly improving on our systems as well. It's a really big topic and a really important one. So I'm glad we're starting to address it a little bit more in the sector as well. So we have about 8 minutes. Let's see.
We can. I can answer Shakira's 2 questions really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
So her question about if you have a fiscal agent, so if you don't have a 501c3 and you have a fiscal sponsor, yes, with the balance sheet and financial summaries, you use theirs. And that's one of the great benefits of having a fiscal sponsor, is if you don't have the financials you need, that's exactly why they are guaranteeing your work, is because they do have those fiscal systems in place. So I would use that. And then, yes, also an indirect cost. So that fee, often a fiscal agent will charge you 10% And yeah, if it is appropriate within what the funder is allowing you to ask for, that indirect cost rate often is what we use to cover that. If your fiscal sponsor is charging you 10% and the funder allows you a 10% indirect cost rate, that is one of those indirect costs, the cost of paying a fee to a fiscal agent.
Great, wonderful. So we have a question also from Dylan. How can an organization convey the importance of time as their most valuable resource without their budget seeming too lopsided on staff costs? As context, generally grassroots orgs start with no paid staff and try to work their way towards this, helping people gain employment, fill out forms related to social services, education, employment, etc. And academic tutoring or counseling are all direct examples of direct services that do not require significant funding for supplies or equipment. It requires money to pay people for their time.
I think this is always an issue that funders look at budgets about, because it goes to long-term sustainability of your projects in the end. If you're asking for this one funder in particular to pay for staff time, what's going to happen when that project period ends? That becomes the challenge. So it's always a balance. And I think it was mentioned earlier that if you've got multiple programs happening, you would request funding on a percentage-wise from amongst the various funders to cover the cost of the staff person for those programs.
Yeah. I would also add, just that put it into your program budget. If you have the opportunity to fill out a budget narrative, which not every proposal does, but you can explain, we can't do this work without an employee, and we need to pay them a living wage in Santa Barbara. And if you also have there's sometimes sections on organizational priorities or whatever, you could even state in there that one of your organizational priorities is to fairly compensate your employees and not pay them $15 an hour just because you're a nonprofit. You know what I mean? You can find ways to put it into the proposal. A lot of the times they do include organizational background, and that's a great place to kind of set forth some of those priorities, thought, beliefs, I don't know. Yeah.
Great.
And I think it also depends on whether you're requesting seed funding for a brand new project, in which case it makes sense. You could allocate more staffing time to that project. And as you're going along and becoming more successful, of course, you're diversifying your funding streams and can allocate those funds across those funding streams.
And so a related question comes from Angelina. Do you budget for volunteer work? Should for some reason it become a paid position? Is that something to anticipate and include?
Yeah, I'll jump in to clarify that. Absolutely. I'll use that example again of what you need to get students from school to an after-school program. You need the van, whether or not you get money for it or someone gives you a van. You need the driver, whether that's a paid position or someone volunteers to drive it. So absolutely, all the things that you already get from a volunteer time-wise or in kind are expenses on the budget. And then when you talk about income, tell the funder how you're getting that met, those needs met. It might be in kind, cash, or volunteer time. But absolutely, if you have someone that's giving you, this happens to organizations quite a bit when they have board members, say, who are really involved and say donates 100 hours, a year to something. And then that board member moves on and you're like, we never thought about how much work she did for us. And now we have to figure out how to pay for that from someone else. So absolutely, if you have volunteer labor, that's still something you need to do your work. So it should have a line item on your expense budget.
Right. And yeah, keeping that account in mind also, just so you can plan for those types of transitions as well, is a really good point. Okay, so we have just one more question, it looks like, and a quick shout out from Shakira, who said she's gonna move here from Canada because she's so encouraged by the systems change structural work being done in our communities. So here we go. So one question, if you're formally organizing a core group of folks seeking to launch a movement or community initiative, can you ask for capital to organize? During COVID, asking for funding for a Zoom license to host meetings, for example, or registering a domain name for a website and creating a virtual space so that you can build a community presence outside of an office space. Are those the types of things you can ask for if you're just starting out?
Sure.
Yeah, the fund, I believe, in the spring cycle, we gave some Zoom license budget.
We did,
items. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a capital expense, however.
Yeah.
It's not a building, a capital expense like a building or something. No, it's a supply cost.
Yeah.
Basically.
Infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, license.
When you do get into specific capital costs, though, not all funders are keen of capital costs. So keep in mind who you're applying to, and a capital cost is like a building or equipment or like computers and things like that. That's capital. And
then, like the physical computer itself. The Zoom license is to me, depending on what your programming is, it's a direct cost because it allows you to deliver service during a remote time.
Correct.
So that's a direct cost.
Yeah. Great. Well, this was a wonderful Q&A. Let's shift over to our homework assignment before session 3. And we'll spend just a minute or so on that if possible.
Yes, so for next time, we have some homework for you all. So one sec, because I can't close the Q&A. Okay, there we go. So for next week, you should have gotten or will be getting a budget quiz form. We encourage you to fill that out to help you out in building your budget. We also encourage you to search for logic models in your field of work and think about how it applies to the work you're doing. I think we're going to be talking about logic models in the next presentation. And then to also practice, to do the writing outcome objectives worksheet, which you will also get. Or have already gotten, I'm not sure, Stanley. But you will also get that and to fill that out to help you in writing your outcomes and objectives. So that's our homework for next week. Even if you didn't have a chance to do the homework last time, or if you don't get a chance to do the homework this time, like you'll still have access to that and you can do it whenever you want. So I encourage you to use those tools because they're really, really great tools to help you lay all that stuff out.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all for your presence today and for your work in the community. Thank you again, Jen, Rachel, and Suzanne, and Naida as well. We'll wrap things up for this session, but again, please stay tuned for our follow-up email with recordings, slides, our homework assignment. Feel free to invite anybody to join us when we reconvene at the same time next week for our final session. I want to mention also that we'll send out some information about how to network with one another outside of that time, as was requested, so that folks can connect and share about their work. And again, please keep the fund in mind in the meantime and how we might be able to support your work. So with that, we're going to sign off. I want to thank everybody again, and take care and be well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye now.
Thank you.